Good morning, everyone. This is just like one of my classes. No one sits in the front. No one sits in the front except Bilal. Bilal will sit in the front. He always does. And he's the only one that doesn't need to sit in the front because he is paying attention the whole time. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rick Afable, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you today to the Fall Speaker Program for the Center for Healthcare Management and Policy here at the Paul Mirage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine. As you may know, we have a quarterly speaker program, and this is the Fall Quarter Speaker Program. And we try every year to put together topics that are most interesting and most valuable to the healthcare industry. And I think we have done that today as well. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. A few little housekeeping items. I just want to acknowledge Diane Ford. There's Diane. She's right here in the middle. I acknowledge Diane Ford for all of her preparation and getting us here together. First off, this program is being recorded, so I hope everybody is given a thumbs up on permission to have this recording. And so with that, we need to use the microphones. And each of your microphones, by the way, Will reminded me, has a little button, and if it's blue, it's off, and if it's, what color is it, Will, when it's on? When it's red, it's on. Figure that one out. Yeah, that's right. What happened to green? You'll need to use the mic speakers when you're speaking, and we'll have a hand mic for everyone in the audience when we have questions, and we will have questions, and we will have a lot of interaction. There's tremendous knowledge, skill, and experience in this entire room, and so let's make this an interactive session. I know that we will, but we'll need to use the microphone in order to do that and do it well. I want to thank our sponsors, the UCI Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute, Be Well Orange County, Children's Hospital of Orange County, the UCI School of Medicine's Train New Trainers Primary Care Psychiatry Fellowship. By the way, I was talking to the staff from the psychiatry program, this fellowship program. What a fantastic thing, which is a program to train primary care providers, doctors, PAs, nurses, others, for a year's fellowship on how to do mental health care and how to provide mental health care. What I said to these two ladies here is that we should pay the participants to come and be part of that. They shouldn't pay a tuition, we should pay them. And oh, by the way, they should get a higher reimbursement for their services because they have that credential. So Jeff Margolis, would you take up that task of taking that on? And if you need some members of your task force, just get some volunteers here from the group. Jeff has written a couple of books, maybe it's even 3 about this very subject. So, but wouldn't it be great? So thank you for sponsoring. But what a great program that would be. I would like to be a fellow in that program myself, to be honest with you. Okay, so here we go. A title for today's program is the Healthcare Workforce Challenges and Solutions. And so we have 4 tremendous panel members who will be sharing their insights on their portion of and their thoughts on the whole issue of the challenges of the healthcare workforce, and more importantly, bringing us some solutions that they may have tried, solutions that they may have considered, maybe even some solutions that may have failed, but we can learn from. And so we'll be talking about that in some great detail. Let me introduce our speakers to you now. Scott Ripley, our first speaker here, is Senior Vice President with Gallagher Benefits Services. To his left is Rita Asayan. Rita is the Chief Human Resources Officer for the South Division of Providence. To Rita's left is Dr. Karen Grimley. Karen is the Chief Nursing Executive at UCLA. And to Karen's left is Chad Lefteris, who's the Chief Executive Officer of UCI Health. So that's our panel. Let's give our panel a round of applause and thank them for being here today. Before we get started, I wanted to make a few level-setting comments, and then we're going to turn it to Scott to begin our program. Healthcare is the largest sector of the U.S. economy. Healthcare is the largest sector of the U.S. economy. You know these numbers. It's a $4 trillion industry. And it's now 20% of the gross domestic product of the United States. By the way, the reason it went up from 18 to 20% of the GDP is not because healthcare increased that much, but rather because the GDP went down 1.5% because of the pandemic. So healthcare is 20% of our economy and a $4 trillion industry. Healthcare is also the largest employer in the United States. 22 million people are employed in healthcare. That's 14% of the workforce of the United States. If you ask the question, how many people are in healthcare in California? 1.7 million people. 1.7 million people. And by the way, if you ask the question, what's the number in Orange County? So I have a simple solution. If anybody ever asks you, what is the number in Orange County? It doesn't matter what the question is. The answer is 10% of California. That's the answer. It's 10% of California. So there's 1.7 million people in workers in healthcare in California. Therefore, there are 170,000 workers in healthcare in Orange County. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people that are working in healthcare. And by the way, healthcare is growing. And why is it growing? We know why it's growing. It's aging of the population. Not only is the median age increasing, but also the number of people are increasing, and people are living a little longer, although COVID had some change in that, mostly because of suicides rather than because of COVID itself, by the way. That's interesting. 10,000 people a day are newly qualified for Medicare. 10,000 people a day are becoming Medicare eligible in the United States every day. And why is the healthcare growing? Well, the aging, also the epidemic of obesity. So we are in a pandemic, or we're coming out of a pandemic. The epidemic of obesity continues, unrelenting, and thus the incidence of chronic illnesses like diabetes, dementia, and some others. And then, of course, there's COVID and the pandemic and all the things that have come and all the changes that have come of that. However, if we look at the data from 2019 to 2021, the workforce in healthcare was reduced by 1.1%. Okay, so at a time when the demand has never been greater because of aging, because of chronic illness, because of the pandemic, because of many other things, at a time when the need has never been greater, the workforce was reduced by 1.1%. 1.1% doesn't sound like much, but at a time when it should be growing because of the need, it's reducing. It's reducing. And we're going to talk about some of the things that are causing that reduction in the workforce in healthcare. Okay? That's about 250,000 workers that have been lost to the industry in the last year to 2 years. That's having a tremendous effect. What are some of the effects of that? Well, the obvious one is that we don't have enough, or we don't have consistent professionals and workers to provide for the needs of patients. That one would be obvious, right? We don't have enough people working in the field. But also there's the element of the economics of supply and demand. So what happens when something is scarce? When that resource is scarce, what happens is it gets more expensive, does it not? Okay? So labor costs in healthcare are skyrocketing, up 37% from 2019 to 2021. So think about that. What industries have you had the basic workforce in a highly service worker-oriented industry like healthcare, and the labor costs have gone up 37%. We're going to talk about that. Patient safety is in decline. For the first time, some of the things that we just take for granted on quality and safety, like central line infections, went up, increased. The number of central line infections increased in 2021 compared to 2020, after 15 years of reductions year over year. The number of falls have increased in hospitals. The number of pressure sores have increased in skilled nursing facilities. Those who work in those industries tell us it's because of a lack of skilled workers. That's why that's happening. Okay? The intent is there, but the capacity is not. And then think about the burden on the existing workforce that is in place. It's tremendous. We hear about burnout a lot, and we're going to talk about burnout, I'm sure, today. It's a major concern. And then it gets down to the bottom line, which is, what about sustainability? Is there sustainability for the existing healthcare system and the existing healthcare structure? Is there sustainability? Can there be sustainability? Kaufman Hall, the financial consulting company that does assessments of the healthcare industry, especially the hospital and healthcare industry, tells us that 50% of hospitals and health systems in the United States will have a negative operating margin in 2022. 50% or more, 50% or more. That has never happened before. And then how sustainable is the existing healthcare system and what kind of changes need to happen? So our topic is healthcare workforce challenges and solutions. I will posit to you that these aren't challenges. This is a crisis. This is a crisis. We are in crisis in healthcare, and it's related mostly to the workforce challenges, and that's the topic for us today. So what I want to ask of all of you is, this is an interactive session. Let's think of this as an executive MBA class, and you are the students, and here are the instructors. And oh, by the way, if Bilal is doing it right, he'll be raising his hand about every 10 seconds, and that's a good thing, by the way. That's a good thing. So we'll ask each of our speakers to make some comments. And then after their comments are done, we'll open it up for a little bit of questions for them. We'll take each one of our speakers, and then we'll have enough time, 30 to 40 minutes at the end, to get into some nice interaction and some discussion. So our first speaker, Scott Ripley, who I mentioned is with Gallagher Benefits, is not specifically in healthcare, and we thought it would be great to have somebody who was not in healthcare tell us about workforce issues generally. A lot of things are changing in the workforce. A lot of decisions are being made that are different than they had been, let's say, 5, 10 years ago. Some of them driven by COVID, some of them driven by remote working, et cetera, but also, there's a new generation. The millennials are now old people. So, Gen Z is now our primary workforce. And so, there's a lot happening in the whole employer industry and the working industry. And so, Scott, why don't you tip us off and get us going?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Turn your microphone. There you go. Yep.
All right, good to go. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here in person. By the way, thanks, Rick, for having me, and thanks for the team, Diane and program team for putting this together. There is no substitute for in-person networking, peer-to-peer relationship building. I mean, that really is a big part of how we learn and get better and build, social capital for the future. So really appreciate it. Yes, there are some generational differences that we've seen, and I used to make millennial jokes until I found out I was one. That was a while ago. I said that right on the bookends. They said, you are a millennial. So I said, I guess I gotta, stop saying those jokes. But there's some big shifts there. So let me kind of tee up maybe a little bit of background about me, what I do, my firm, and then I think it'll provide some insight to maybe think through the rest of the focus here. So I am a employee benefits consultant with Gallagher. So Gallagher, if you're not familiar, is a large multinational insurance consulting organization. So my role here is I lead the Orange County practice for employee benefits. So we help design, manage, implement, communicate employee benefit programs for the employer market. So if you look at our role, a lot of what's impacting us in the room here today, impacts, our role and our clients downstream. You think about, the healthcare increases that we're facing now. And this is going to be a tremendous impact on the employer market for years to come. So if you look at, how tight it is with, the talent shortage, wage pressure, everything else, that has a direct impact on what we see throughout the economy. So what I will tell you is that I do have, I'd say, my finger on the pulse of what employees want, and maybe more importantly, what employers are willing to give. And if you look at, the history here over the past, I'll call it decade, there's been a dramatic shift in terms of what employers have had to give to the labor market. And this isn't just healthcare. So what the way I will tee this up is that, I'm going to give you more of a macro level perspective, and then I'm going to be, maybe kind of whittle it down to how, healthcare is uniquely impacted. And, surprise, everything is intensified with healthcare. Everything that I say, you can just kind of times it by, 5 or 10 X for healthcare because of, some of the issues that you face that are just unique to the industry. So while I'm not a healthcare professional, I'll say that I'm healthcare adjacent. So I'm right there. So let me kind of walk you through, what the market has looked like in terms of talent. So most the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis are going to be HR leaders, like Rita. I work with CFOs, I work with CEOs. But the primary, focus for me is, the people part of the organization, which is HR. So we look at the labor market, and let's just kind of rewind the clocks back and kind of look at, as we got out of the Great Recession, that was a tough time as we were in the recession. And with any recession, you never know when you're in it and you never know when you're out of it. So when we kind of woke up and it was, 2010, 2011, 2012, we saw those as the go-go years, right? We just saw, the economy just start to poof up and just keep moving. And when that happened, we saw a tremendous burden on employers to find talent. We found that there was already a talent shortage with all industries. And I think everybody in this room here maybe feels maybe a little bit differently in terms of, the intensity on healthcare. But every HR department was struggling to find talent. And that got, again, each year it got more and more challenging. What do we do to attract and retain? I used to give a lot of presentations to the HR community, and that was almost always the number one topic. So as we led up to the pandemic, that was hot. How do we get the right talent? Once the pandemic hit, for most industries, there was a bit of reprieve in the labor market. Now, there was an existential threat to many businesses, but there was some reprieve in terms of talent. Was there any reprieve for healthcare in the pandemic? I'd say no, right? I think all of us in this room, it just went into overdrive. And there was a level of intensity that we could have never imagined. So the amount of issues that you faced before just increased. And I think, that created more issues with, burnout and PTSD through COVID and other issues that, create challenges with the labor force. But if you look at the macro level, we saw maybe a slight dip in that demand for talent. And then shortly thereafter, we saw, a lot of the bills get passed. There was more money in the economy, whoosh, pop right back up. And so now we're right back where we started, to where this is, again, a super tight labor market. The one thing that many industries have to their advantage that you do not is that, there's a looming recession. Again, we may be in one, we may not, depends on who you talk to. But that looming recession has a positive impact for the talent market. So if you look at, I've got a lot of, technology clients. If you look at the vast majority of companies, Fortune 500 companies, I think over 50%, the new stat is over 50% are either having a RIF, reduction in force, so layoffs, or they're in a hiring freeze. So we see that recession having, a relatively positive impact, negative in many ways, but positive in terms of talent, in terms of wage pressure. So a lot of our technology clients were first to benefit from, these mass layoffs of the tech companies. Tech companies are hit hardest by the bond market, interest rates. As they go up, that's hit tech hardest first, and it will cascade down. But again, if we look at where we are in healthcare, there's certainly no reprieve. There's not any sort of, writing on the wall that this is going to get any easier. I think that it will become more challenging to have that pipeline of qualified talent and even, traction retention. So if we look at, as where we are now, we're in this new space, right? A looming recession, things could happen. What's going to be the next step? When we look at the priorities that we're faced with, we do major surveys every year. Of course, Gallagher has clients in every industry. We've got a very, very large niche focus with healthcare. So we've got, I think, nationally, maybe 2,000, 2,500 clients in healthcare. So when we do our surveys, we can slice and dice based on data. So if you look at the top HR priorities at a macro level, attracting and retaining talent, number one. Number two, wage pressure. 3, addressing burnout among employees. And number 4, remote working and flexibility. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. I could imagine that there's not one piece there that does not overlap consistently with what we're faced with here in healthcare. And again, the major difference is just how challenging each of those items are. We look at attracting talent and retaining talent. Karen's going to talk a lot about that. I think, with our healthcare clients, retaining nurses is by far the number one priority for an HR staff. How do we do that? What's the future look like? If we look at wage pressure, again, I talked about it when I teed it up. That's, overall inflation and the talent shortage has a dramatic, impact on how we look at wage pressure, what employees want. Employees are in the driver's seat right now across all levels. Right? They've been in an empowered position to stake a claim of what they want to do. And I was talking to the table in the back, and it could be generational. It could be part of where we are in the economy, but employees really are in the driver's seat of drawing a line in the sand and saying, I'm not doing it. And if you want me to do it, I'll just leave. I'll figure out something that I want to do in my life. And we're seeing that happen across all industries. And I think healthcare has hit it hard first. And there's no question in my mind that, COVID had a really tough, impact on employees. I mean, I can't imagine what the staff had to go through, is going through COVID. So I think we kind of, I think have to look at it through a lens of empathy. That this is a challenging industry. We have to do better and do more to try to prepare for the future. But again, all of these issues are impacting every employer, but in particular, and I'd say healthcare. Burnout, number one, obviously, and then the one that was surprising to me, which as an outsider, you may not think, well, hey, it's healthcare. You got to be in person. There's no remote working or flexibility. Surprise, surprise. That was a tremendous demand. Was no. We want flexibility. We want remote working. I think that some employers have found a way to infuse that into the overall recruitment and retention strategy of and making it more available to have remote work or flexibility. I think that's really interesting. I think that some CFOs have become bigger proponents when you can look at having remote work for maybe IT. Right? We've seen some of our clients go to IT for lower cost of living areas. So, your IT department's remote. You've got other pieces that could be more remote, and that lowers your cost. So, I think there is some value there. But I'd like to hear more discussion on this. But as I open it up, there's no replacement for in-person learning, in-person relationship building, and I think overall cultural development, which is if you look at culture for any healthcare institution, hospital or other, I mean, that's a big part of how we are going to be able to attract and retain and differentiate. What's a unique employer value proposition, to the market, to your, potential team members. And so I think that I'd love to hear a little bit more about, because for many, many years, we were doing focus groups, surveys, and then every focus group leading up to the pandemic, it was flexibility. Number one, employees have been demanding this for years. And at first I thought it was more of a, a regional deal, because hey, look, you can't afford to, live in Orange County, you buy a house in Inland Empire, you've got to commute, people don't want to take 2 hours, each way. That made sense. What I found out is that's more national. This has been, on the hearts and minds of our workforce for many, many years, is how to be more flexible. And they don't want to be in a car and tied to, working in office all the time. So what we, heard was that, shucks, leadership would love to do that, but, it's just too difficult. We got to get laptops for everybody, and we can't figure out the IT stuff. Guess what happened? The second March 14th rolled around, boom, all of a sudden they figured it out real quick, right? Within 24 hours, a laptop's in everybody's hands, and then they figured out remote work was, so I think, what we're finding is now that it's been proven, it's hard to take that away. And it's just too much power in the hands of the workforce to say they're not really going to give that up quite yet. And the CHRO, the former CHRO of Google, said that many employers are bringing employees back to the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week. And he said, well, they're going to wake up and be a boiled frog. They're going to be there 5 days a week when they don't even know it yet. And I think what we found is no. There's a line in the sand. No matter if it's a large technology firm, if it's a smaller, boutique consulting, financial services, and even healthcare, which again I thought was a little bit surprising, is that there's a lot of pushback. So, I think I again want to keep this open for discussion, conversation. Again, my lens is more of a macro level. I do see both sides. I see the healthcare side, but I think in terms of solutions. There's a lot of things that are getting thrown out there. I think I'm not going to tell this group what's going to work and what's not. I'd like to hear from the panel. A couple things that come to mind to me that have been maybe differentiators for some of the clients that we work with is I think starting with leadership. And embedding, a lot of what, the cultural and the values are of the organization, and making sure that there's a consistent message to leaders, because they are your front lines in terms of, having all of your employees look up to them. They've got their finger on the pulse of what employees want. I think, one example that we've seen, we talk about leadership, and this ties into the table here and Rick. I mean, we were doing a lot of work with mental health, training, awareness, among leaders and supervisors, because HR may be trained, maybe the top levels of leadership may know it, but what about managers and supervisors? How are we training them to be prepared to, help tell the message, help identify signs and symptoms of burnout, of potential issues? Because those are the things that can save lives, number one, most important, but also, keep an idea of how we keep our best talent and how we attract and retain and tell a consistent story. So, to me, leadership, it's not the traditional leadership development training. It's a focus on leadership to get an alignment of the values and the differentiators as an organization. So I will kind of pass that back, and happy to kind of fill in as I see fit. But yeah.
Thanks so much, Scott. What we'll do is I'm going to change my strategy here. So let's hold our questions. Please write down your questions and who you want to relate those questions to, and we'll let the whole panel speak, because there's continuity to this discussion. So Rita, Scott said attract and retain. Number 2, wage pressure. Number 3, managing burnout. Number 4, remote working and flexibility in working. As a lead HR resource director and manager, give us some insights as to what it is you're doing and how you're feeling all of this, and what thoughts do you have on the subject?
Absolutely. And he actually did my entire presentation for me.
Oh, for heaven's sakes. Wow. We should have talked before.
There will be a lot of similarities, I believe, in what you hear from us, and a lot of similarities in what you're experiencing. And what I'd love to do before I start sharing my comments is I'd love to understand in the room, raise your hand if you've been in healthcare for 5 years. Okay. For those 10 years? Okay. For those 15 years? 20 years? Okay. 25? Whoa. 30? Incredible. I'm going to go for 35 too. How about 35? Okay. Oh!
3 of us.
Wow. I can only imagine the amount of...
40.
40? At the time we were violating child labor laws. They were hired at 10. So just putting that into perspective, I can only imagine the amount of change that you've experienced throughout your careers. If you just think about the last 3 years, my goodness, the change. And let alone when I think of it from your lens. And one of the things, if anything, that COVID has taught me and others in my profession is the need to be resilient and the need to be able to pivot, especially in an industry where we tend to be slow to change. We have years and years and years of practice that's worked well for us. And why change if it's worked well for us? But the dynamics around us are causing us to be thinking differently. And I'm reminded of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. Our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. And I think that's very apropos to what we're experiencing, because we are in the middle of change. We have been over the last several years. And as I think about the challenges ahead of us, the Great Resignation is something that we've all heard, we're living through, we're experiencing in our workforces, and trying to understand how can we combat that? How can we get our arms around that? How do we understand what that means? Why are we seeing the Great Resignation? What was the role of COVID in Great Resignation? I believe a lot of people had an opportunity to reevaluate their priorities, having gone through what we went through over the last several years. Another part of it is there are a lot more career options available to people. And a lot more where, the more that we see entrepreneurs and innovators and creators who want to create their own, do they view healthcare perhaps as a traditional career? So I think that adds an element as well to it. And the fact of the balance that people are seeking. Whether it was from COVID or other pressures that people have experienced, seeking a balance that's going to bring them that joy and that meaning to what they do. And the reason I like to reflect on that is because when I think about the solutions and when I think about the people strategy that we're developing, we have to understand those dynamics. We have to understand the external forces and the internal forces and how all of that contributes to our overarching people strategy. When I think of a people strategy, it's not HR's job to create the people strategy. It's all of us as leaders. HR should be at the hip of the business, of the CFO, of the CNO, of the CEO, of the chief marketing officer to understand the business imperatives, business development, business marketing, all of those imperatives, and how are we aligning to create a workforce that we can attract, that we can retain to really deliver on that promise. And when I think through the lens of people strategy, there's three buckets, if you say, that I try to anchor to. First and foremost, it's culture. And to some, culture might be a soft word, but I don't want to underestimate the role of culture. Who are we as an organization? People want to join in an organization that's a higher calling, that is bigger than a job, that allows them to bring their passion and serve a purpose. When I think about that intersection between purpose and passion, and if we can get that right, I think we will have a great opportunity of connecting to the hearts and minds of those who want to be part of an organization that fulfills that mission, that fulfills that purpose, and that brings joy back to medicine, back to nursing practice, back to practice in general. COVID challenged us to find that joy. Were we finding that joy? And if we weren't, and so many people have been challenged in many different ways and tapped out and burnt out, how do we bring that joy back to practice? And I think that's very important as we think through our culture and what the culture serves. When I think of culture, obviously employee engagement is a key part of that. Are we hearing the voices of our employees? At Providence, we call our employees caregivers. So you may hear me use that term. Are we hearing the voice of our employees? And are we acting on it? What are they telling us at a macro level as well as at a micro level? What are they telling us, and how do we try to understand that to really be able to deliver an environment and a culture that connects to their hearts? Another area of significant focus that every organization should be investing in is in the space of DEI&B, to make sure we have representation, to make sure that we are recruiting a diverse population and they see themselves represented at all levels of the workforce. How do we create more diversity of background, diversity of thought in our organizations? How do we create an environment where our people feel included, that they belong, and that our systems are equitable? It's not easy to do that, but it takes a commitment. And I believe that if we do DEI&B right, we are going to connect with hearts and minds of people. And another is well-being. Again, as a result of COVID, as a result of burnout, as a result of working long hours and questioning oneself, whether is this it for me? I was sharing before we started, I read a McKinsey article where it indicated for those leaving healthcare, 54% choose to go to a different industry. They don't want to do healthcare anymore. So how are we focusing on well-being programs and making it meaningful for people, for them to take advantage of that and really be able to connect to their own needs? So that's in the place of culture. The next, and we can't underestimate, is total rewards, especially because of the market dynamics, especially because of some of the labor contract settlements that we've seen along the West Coast. And they're not like anything we've experienced in prior years. That creates the affordability question for us. Are we going to be able to afford this? And what does this mean for our non-union represented hospitals? And what does this mean in the long run when we talk about sustainability? What does that mean in the long run? And how do we do it in a way where we're recognizing what the worth of our employees, yet doing it in a fashion that is going to be sustainable and affordable? Another dynamic that we're seeing is for our support services, EVS, food services, we have new competitions. We're competing with McDonald's. We're competing with Del Taco. We're competing with hotels. We're competing with those who want to go and be nannies and take care of children. the competition has changed. And we have to think about how do we stay nimble in that space, especially if we are focused on attracting that very best. And recognizing that when I think of a total rewards program, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Our priorities are different, our needs are different, our family needs are different, our lifestyles are different. So how do we try to think about offering total reward programs that is going to attract that younger demographic who just joined, who probably has a lot of school debt, and that's their focus, as opposed to that parent who is now raising children, wants a level of balance, as opposed to Gen Z. I have 2 Gen Z boys, and they're looking for time off. That's what matters to them. Yes, they want good pay, but they will forego some of that pay for time off because they want to be able to have that balance. How about that caregiver who is closer to retirement and wants the security of their retirement? When we have 4 or 5 different generations in the workforce, we have to recognize that a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. So how do we create an environment and a program where we are able to make it as personalized as possible? Lastly, my third is in the space of growth and development. And I don't mean in the mere nature of training. It's definitely critical. But as we think about the future of the workforce, I'm told by our analytics leader that we will have, in a few years, 2 million nurses short in the U.S. He says we have more nurses now, and you may have a different view. He says we have more nurses now than we ever will have nurses. So that puts an imperative on us of redesigning the future of the workforce. Are there opportunities where we look at redeploying some of the work that they're doing, work that may not be at top of license, at top of practice, giving them that support model necessary in order for them to function at that top level? Another aspect of it is reskilling. They joined into the workforce, but they may have aspirations of career growth, whether it's ladders or lattices, right? Whether it may be along the development of leadership or it may be expanding on other skills. If they have other passions, innovation and creativity that they want to bring, entrepreneurial skills, how do we engage them in other aspects, whether it be business development or marketing or IT or what have you, to be able to create an opportunity where they feel fulfilled, they feel they're learning, reskilling, developing, and charting their own career pathways. And another big part of this, lastly, is the focus on our leaders. And my most concern at many times is the middle managers. That's who I think is generally forgotten in a way because of how much is expected of them. They are working with the front line. They're getting pressures from senior leadership. In many organizations, when we've had to make changes, we put more on them, from managing your payroll, obviously managing productivity, managing your business, engaging with your caregivers. So when I think through the lens of a frontline manager, they have to have 2 different focal points: leader of people and leader of task. And how are we equipping them for them to be able to do that effectively and to be able to find the time to be able to engage with their workforce? So there are a lot of programs that we are experimenting at Providence. I've been at Providence for about 8 months, so fairly new. Came from Kaiser Permanente before that. And very honored to be part of an organization that is so mission focused. And we anchor to our mission. We anchor to the Providence promise of know me, care for me, and ease my way. And how do we thread that in everything we do in all of these aspects to know our people, to care for them, and to ease their way? So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'm looking forward to questions at the end that you'll have and for us to learn from one another.
Thank you so much, Rita. Great. Karen, you're at ground zero. The nursing industry, nurses are, as a group, the largest professional element of healthcare. Rightfully so, in many ways, they determine the direction. Your profession determines the direction of healthcare. And Rita gave us a few statistics. I know you have a few more on that piece of paper right in front of you that just came out. Many of us saw the pretty challenging statistics on nursing today. You're leading a major healthcare organization as it relates to nursing. Karen, give us some of your insights.
I have so many things I've written down from listening to Scott and Rita. Rita, one thing what you piqued in me just to get started, I want to give you guys a couple of just things that drive me in what I do as the Chief Nursing Executive at UCLA Health, as looking forward to make sure we have the right resources to promote healthcare, regardless the setting. It takes 17 years for healthcare to take evidence and put it into practice. We were a lot faster during COVID, but that is a statistic that lives in the healthcare industry. The other question is, should we be surprised by the Great Resignation, given the fact that we have 10,000 people every day shifting into baby boomer nirvana, right? We're all turning 65, and that will continue now, I think, I'm trying to think how old my sister is, I think it's about 6 more years till that 10,000 per day changes. So just thinking about that, we're at the peak right now. So the question is, maybe they should be retiring. A lot of colleagues that I know postponed their retirement and found themselves in COVID and then chose not to retire to help their fellow nurses and other clinicians. The always change is a given. But within change, if you study chaos theory and systems theory, right, when you look at that, there's always a similarity or something you can identify as a pattern in it. So thinking about that, nursing shortages, there's a nurse historian named Ellen Baer who gave me some sage advice many years ago. I was telling her about how challenging this nursing shortage was when I was in my doctorate. And I was working on my a course with her, and she said, "Would you stop? There has been a nursing shortage since the day nurses went into hospitals." That was in 1906. And fast forward, she was right. It's not a question of will there be a nursing shortage, it's how bad will it be? How much attention do we need to pay it to now to prevent the next? And those are some of the challenges that I've been faced with since I landed as a chief nursing officer in South Florida just before season. And if you've ever been in South Florida as a healthcare administrator, from Thanksgiving to Passover, the patient population for most hospitals goes from about 85% occupancy to well over 110% because of snowbirds and migration for the holiday and also for the weather. There are a lot of things that are put in place in different places like that where they've been used to dealing with periods of severe scarcity and periods of no demand. And so what's really neat is a lot of the strategies and things that I learned then, I've actually been able to bring forward to now. So the goal, after you raise your hand for the 40th year in healthcare, you start to put some of the things together. So my goal in working with my team was, how do you stay ahead of the curve? And fortunately for us, some of the things that were really important to staying ahead of the curve, we had already put in place just prior to COVID. The things that we have to look at in healthcare, especially as it relates to nursing and maintaining a healthy, engaged workforce, is what are we doing to address the middle layer, the nurse managers and the other clinicians who manage the bedside nurses and the people closest to the patient. There's 2 things we have to do. We have to make sure we have the right number of them, but we also have to make sure we have the right processes and procedures and practices in place that people function independently when they go to deal with a central line or they go to deal with a piece of equipment. So that we have checklists and balances where we are consistently doing the tasks the same way. And nursing is far from a task-oriented profession. It's actually a profession that's built on clinical judgment and critical thinking. However, most people who are looking at nursing from the outside in don't see that. They see the nurse managing a monitor. They see the nurse managing a technical skill, when in reality, that's the end point for everything that they've learned and developed and done for themselves. So I think some of the things that have been really important to me as a leader is, how do you maintain the value equation? How do you make sure that experience and quality and the cost equal value for our patients? And we have to do that by remaining patient-centered. Not just for COVID, not just because you're a magnet organization, but because it's the right thing to do for the patient. So the importance of aligning values as it relates to being patient-centered is more than just talk. You have to live it. And it's not just nursing. Policies, leadership, et cetera, all have to be aligned to the same goals. If your leadership team doesn't believe that the end user of a product makes all the difference in the world, then why do you need the end user? And I've seen that in nursing across the years. Oh, we can replace a nurse with a whatever. And I think that that's some of the things nursing has to do. We have to do a better job of speaking up about what we do and what we know, so that other people who are our colleagues or people who are our patients or our communities know not that they need us, but why they need us. And those are some of the things that I think we've learned through COVID when you talk to nursing leaders across the community. COVID, I think, was a real aha moment for a lot of us in healthcare. If you go back and read 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic, you'll learn a lot. There's a lot in there that held true, even during this COVID pandemic with all the technology we have. The fear, and not just the fear of getting COVID in the beginning, but the fear of livelihood and the fear of change and the threat of death. Those were all very real for people, educated people, who you're like, well, read the science, read the literature. What are you afraid of, right? Just put a mask on and gloves and go ahead, you know what I mean? We discounted a lot of that, and in reality what we had was a scared group of caregivers who kept showing up at their own peril. And I think that as leaders in healthcare, or leaders in anything, we need to understand that we ask our employees to do that all the time. A nuclear power plant, a hospital, it doesn't matter. There are dangers and threats in everything we do. It's imperative that if we're going to be leaders in any industry, that we need to understand that, and we need to own it. And to Rita's point, how do we know it? We know it by knowing our staff. How many of us make the time to actually engage with staff at the bedside, in the clinic, in the community, to find out what it's really like? I was an ICU nurse. I was an ER nurse. I did all that. And I can sit here and say, well, oh, for crying out loud, that's just a pneumonia. All you have to do is this. It's not like that anymore. We can't rest on our experience as the answer to today's healthcare conundrums. We can use our experience to be sure we ask the right questions. So those are some of the things that not only my rounding, but the rounding that the leadership team did, not only through COVID, but ongoing. It was being up on the floors, it's being engaged with the staff, and it's being consistently available in good times as well as bad. When you only show up because something went wrong, no one's ever going to call you. And once you get that understanding, you understand the importance of showing up once a week, once a month, whatever you can do that you can do consistently, so that staff can come to rely on you, because that's where trust is built. And that's been the cornerstone. Most of the successful organizations during COVID did it based on trust and based on collaboration with their staff. One of the things that I'm very proud of that the UCs did, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but we promised the day we went underground, March, I think for us our first patient came in March 13th. The University of California announced no layoffs, and they identified 128 hours of available time with pay for any person suffering any of the effects or their family's effects from COVID. That, of course, has since gone on to be 80 hours for the next 2 years, I think, right? So anyway, we called it EPSL. So that, in essence, took a lot of the stress and strain off a lot of people in healthcare, because people who had been on the job were suddenly pushed out to remote. And to Scott's point, It happened overnight. Yep, here's your laptop, we'll see you. And so they were coping with a lot of things that were very different. And I think that understanding how to integrate access to your HR professionals, your finance professionals, so that you could stay current with what you had to do to maintain the operation of the hospital and your different departments became critical. And I think that most of us set up command centers, and I think from the command center, we actually still have a virtual command center open today to deal with COVID communication. But for the first 120 days for us, the COVID command center was a very real interactive place where people could gather. And it was in that time that we congealed as a team. We were a good team before, but the fact of the matter is that despite all the remoteness, the people coming into that room, even the leaders from those remote areas, the coming together allowed us to become very strong and very connected in a way that we could rely on one another and build trust that things were happening. So those were some of the really important things that we faced. Despite all of that, we were starting to experience turnover. Nursing turnover is not tolerated well in any organization. I don't know if you've all experienced that yet, but I have in multiple settings. So I think some of the things that Becker's came out with, if you get Becker's review online or whatever, this past week they put out 23 numbers that you should know around nursing turnover and vacancy rate, and they're appalling. The nursing, they're very scary numbers for somebody who's been doing this for a living. Just when you look at the national average for turnover rates, the national average was about 12 to 14% prior to COVID. It's 27% today. Wow. That's 1 in 3. Okay? So 1 in 3 nurses that you hire is probably going to leave soon, so just be prepared. What are you going to do about it? That's where, for us, the strategy was put together with human resources, finance, and nursing. And together, it was a comprehensive, multi-directional approach to making sure we had built a mechanism to not only attract new talent and experienced nurses, but also to ensure that we kept the ones we had. So through a level of short-term strategies and long-term strategies, we bundled up how we were going to take care of nursing. And the things that we did, we never thought we could do that fast. The only time we could do it fast in the past was if there was an imminent strike. I could bring 1,000 nurses in from all over the country and have them oriented and ready to go on the floors in 3 days. If there was no strike threat prior to COVID, it would take me months to do that because, it's just inconvenient for us to do that right now. And I've kind of got this seminar I'm producing for XYZ, so I can't help with onboarding. During COVID, the fact that we all aligned ourselves and set the strategy together to make sure that we had enough staff to meet the rising demand, which I think we're all still experiencing with people trying to catch up with their illnesses, we had to lay something in fast. And we were able to create a budget model that created an accommodation for operational vacancies, not your traditional turnover and vacancy rates that we produce and publish nationally as benchmarks, but what's your actual operational vacancy? Where are those people going? How many people are on FMLA? I don't know about you, ours tripled. I went from an average FMLA in my nursing areas our nursing areas from about 50 to 150. These are people out either intermittently for 12 weeks a year or 12 weeks at a whack. Not to mention disabilities that suddenly cropped up with long COVID and some of the other details we were faced with, plus the exorbitant amount of sick call. And then that EPSL I told you about, that 128 hours also. So all of that just really was creating stress in the inpatient units especially, where we really needed to replace 2 to 6 FTEs in each of those individual nursing units to allow opportunity to hire people in to cover the productive hours needed to care for the patients in the beds. We implemented that. At the same time, we reduced the span of control for the unit directors, so they went from managing 100 people to sharing the management of 100 people with 2 others, so that we were giving the unit director more elbow support and also providing more elbow support for the staff by putting this clinical nurse manager in the middle. That person has been a lifeline for both of those groups since we implemented it at the beginning of COVID. So we had the operational change with our budgeting around the vacancy. We had the financial changes and the accommodation that the CFO did. We actually zeroed out our budget during COVID and rebuilt it based on the necessary hours per patient day for each of our patient populations in our acute care environment. It sounds simple, but for those of you, for nursing and financial officers to find a middle of the road that they can live with in a hospital setting to build a budget, it's like the second coming. This is my 5th rodeo. This is the first time that I've been able to be involved in a situation where that happened. It is so critical that you and that nursing leadership and financial leadership are on the same page when they're planning budgeting at that level. That said, we migrated that, and then we identified our vacancies, and we identified what it would take to fill the operational vacancies, and then how would we continue to make sure that professionally we were bringing people on at the right level to meet the clinical competencies required for our patient population. Academic medical centers sit in a very unique position. They're grossly over-resourced as compared to a community hospital or a critical access hospital. So it's incumbent on us to understand that we're different and that we shouldn't compare ourselves to other groups. But at the same time, we have an obligation to create models, structures, and ideas for people to take advantage of who don't have the time or the bandwidth to do it for themselves. So we really have we've packaged this in such a way that we can share it beyond our doors. We've put together an onboarding strategy that allowed us to recruit over 1,000 nurses in 2021. Of the 1,000 nurses we recruited, we were actually able to have only 173 of those be new grads. The remainder were experienced nurses from the region, and we brought them on with nothing more than a commitment to professional development and a reasonable competency-based orientation. And of course, the university's pay package isn't too bad either. But that said, we were able to do that in such a way that it allowed us to navigate through what many organizations across the country are going belly up over. And so I think that the benefit here was having a team that was looking ahead. So in the middle of a crisis, you can't stay focused and granular on the crisis. You need to set your sights. Where do I need to be when we come out of this? What are the resources I'm going to need? How do we migrate through it? And that's probably where the leadership team and the nursing leadership team come together with how they collect data from the staff. And I think that's the critical point. So how did I get through it? Great team, great collaboration, aligned incentives, aligned goals. Activating partnerships with key leaders in your organization and beyond is critical. And listening to your staff and consistent availability with them. As an aside, some of the ways that we've maintained that since we've come out of COVID, I host rounding 1 day a week on at least one unit for 30 minutes to talk with staff. We host a town hall every 2 weeks via Zoom for all nurses and anybody else who wants to listen. And then in addition to that, we've identified ways to create recognition programs, whether it's giving somebody a meal card when I'm rounding, having a recognition where we give them a $25 Target card because they were witness doing something wonderful. We've built that in too. So do not forget the recognition if you're trying to retain. So I have a lot I'd like to say. I think the things that we were able to do, and some was all of the different comprehensive approach that we put to managing our labor workforce resulted in us not only being able to manage a workforce and maintain the right number of people to meet the demand for the patient population, it also allowed us the opportunity to, I lost my train of thought. It was really good too. But we got to build the workforce, but in addition to that, we got to actually maintain our value. Our CLABSI scores, our CAUTI scores, our falls, and our pressure injuries got better. And I think it's because of the investment we made in the people closest to the patients. And I think that's the takeaway that I'd like to leave all of you with, is anything else I said here today, if you're not in sync with the people who care for your business, it puts you at risk to fail. That's it.
Thank you, Karen. Chad, it was once said that if it was easy, anyone would do it. What's going on today in healthcare is not easy. So your comments from the chief executive's seat.
Thank you, and order matters. So going last here is really hard, and I think there's a few comments that I want to leave you with just from where I sit, and I really want to back up a little bit and think about what you just said about what we have all experienced and lived through collectively. And I'm going to just say the healthcare provider space for a moment. And so I call it that we're in a phase of post-traumatic growth syndrome, right? We have to grow, all of us in the provider space. We're growing. We have recovery to be made. And oh, by the way, you've heard all the facts about what's happening to our workforce, which is, well, that was not a pep talk that you started with. So, so that's the reality, right? But I do want to underscore what is a sort of a touchy-feely word, culture. And it's funny. So I'm the only person I know who's dumb enough to say yes to a CEO of a health system job during a global pandemic. So I took over on April Fool's Day, 3 weeks after we shut down the state of California. I was the chief operating officer prior for a year and a half. And that was an interesting moment. Talk about bad timing. And 7 days later, I started my first email to all coworkers, to all faculty, 8,000 plus, about where we were with supplies, where we were with patient volume, all the things that were in the headlines that you couldn't really talk about. And some other colleagues got word that I was sending this out daily at the very top of the email about what was happening in our organization. Red light, green light, yellow light for supplies, right? They called me and they're like, you can't share that information elsewhere, right? Not in the UCs. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I have to share this information. There's so much angst, anxiety. You remember it was just freak out moment, right? And we were being very honest, transparent, and open from the start about what we knew, what we didn't know, and what we learned, and Karen, you alluded to this, is that sometimes leading during a crisis is not just leaping to action. Doesn't mean you have to move first. So what we learned was watching, listening, following the science, and then communicating that in a very transparent way to our colleagues. So that's something that we continue today. Luckily, I don't do a daily email, but we still do it every week. And we update on all kinds of things. And it's funny, when I go out rounding, the comment was like, oh, we missed your emails. Or I missed it yesterday because I was off. And I'm like, we got to get you some more time off or something if that's what you missed. But the point is, it's now becoming the expectation, right, that we're communicating in such a transparent way, and it builds culture differently, right? The best way to recruit, and everybody talked about recruitment challenges, is to have an engaged workforce that are your best salespeople, right? And they will be out and they will do the recruitment. That's the treadmill we never get off of, not since 1906, and we will never get off of that need, right? So one of the things that we're doing is we've created a strategic workforce development plan, no different than a strategic plan we might have for various service lines or your business units or whatever you may have. And it is absolutely cross-functional, just like Rita described, just like Karen described, that it's really no good for HR to develop that on their own, right? So it's actually created from the business unit level, and then HR supports versus the other way around. So I would encourage you to think about that order because it really matters. So we also think about the idea of, okay, yeah, we're going to recruit, yes. But the kids that are in middle school today are the people that I want at our bedside when they're age appropriate, right? Middle school. We do a lot of things within our School of Medicine, within our other training programs, that we reach out into communities, into schools, and get folks interested in some of these fields. More focused, though, on physician training, actually. And so we're starting to pivot that and talk about how are we doing that and reaching deeper and going to younger and younger classes, right? We want them to get bit by the healthcare bug earlier, and hopefully they'll come to work with us or one of these great organizations represented here, and stay within our region, because that's a very important point about generating jobs here as well. So I actually am saying that we're spending more time on retention than we are on recruitment, because frankly, for me, really, retention is the new recruitment, right? You've heard this already. So we're spending so much time on retaining talent, being flexible, being creative. I actually think that in healthcare, we really suck at talent management or succession planning or whatever term. It's terrible in healthcare. There's no pathway. There's no defined linear path like there is in other industries. We take the best phlebotomist who can stick the toughest vein, and we make them the manager of phlebotomy. And then they wake up one day and like, holy, I just want to go draw blood, right? We didn't train them differently. They were really, really good at an expert task. Outstanding. And we said, oh, you should lead. Go lead. Right? We don't develop them, right? Rita, you said that, right? So we've turned that on its head, right? We've created a talent management program within UCI Health that is different, where we're developing those, you heard it, those middle leaders and other leaders to lead differently, not just technically lead, right? But to lead differently and to lead their teams in different ways that we're going to train them how to do. Because a lot of that you don't get necessarily directly in your workforce, in your work time, or necessarily even in degree programs. So we're spending a lot of time there. We have a long way to go, in my opinion. And I do think several of you mentioned this idea of creating a true sense of belonging within our workforce. And I think that always existed before, but I think the pandemic certainly reminded us of the need to do that. And I think that's something that all fits together nicely with what we're doing at UCI Health as well. Maybe the final thing before I just open it up more, Dr. Fable, is that competition for talent, I think, has changed dramatically over our last even decade. When I think about whether I'm filling an executive position job or a cook in the kitchen job, you mentioned our competition is different at all levels as well. The fact is, there's a lot of other, I'm going to say, new entrants into the marketplace that are taking what would otherwise be traditional health system talent. And that means we have to compete very, very differently, right? And we will never be, at the University of California at least, we will never be the market leader in pay, for example. It's not what we're about. We want to be competitive, right? So what can we offer you as a talented recruit that will allow you to come into this family, as I call it? So we're talking about how do we do that and compete while, did you know that Walmart Health, for example, or Dollar General Health, for example, you name the list, are hiring the talent that I would have normally been hiring to complete my executive team. Not necessarily Providence. Yes, they're hiring too, right? But it's a whole different set of competitors that are taking our talent pool, and so therefore the pool is shrinking, right? So how are we going to really differentiate ourselves so that we can really bring in the best talent and go forward? So we're spending a lot of time on how we're doing that within our community as well. So I think I'll stop there, Dr. Fable, because I could go on, but why don't we tee it up from there?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Let's give our panel a round of applause for the presentations, and let's open it up for questions. Who would like to begin with the question? Please. We need a microphone. So let's. Thank you, guys. Ricardo, right over there, right? Thank you. Thank you.
So a common theme is developing pipelines. And so you talked about starting programs for mentorship and leadership and management. That all requires money and funding. We're all really strapped for that right now. So it's really having executive leadership make that decision on how much are we willing to invest, right? Whether it's retention initiatives or developing pipelines. So when it comes to pipelines, what's the feasibility of like how much we're willing to invest? Are we willing to partner up with education systems like universities to have their work, their students just become our, caregivers? Or, I mean, it's such a great idea. It's been around for a long time, but I think we need to pour more into it. And I mean, in a sense of earlier, the better. You said middle school. So what is it, sponsoring education? Is it creating the programs and being investors and just having that pipeline feed it so that in 5 years we're not as bad off as we are now? So I guess my question is really how much should we be investing?
I forgot to ask, could you identify yourself and who you're with? I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Hala Taba. I'm a FEMBA student here at UCI, just started, and I work for Providence St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I start maybe? So there's probably some stat out there that says, what ratio, 5-to-1 or whatever that you invest. So I think this is not an either or. You have to do this, period. Again, it's a very strategic imperative, just like how do we grow our business in X, Y, or Z. So I think that is where we start, not where we finish. So investing in programs, pipeline, partnerships, right, that was mentioned as well. Maybe that's one of the beauties of the pandemic, is that as health systems, we all had to partner differently. And so now how do we partner even more differently in the future for talent, I think is going to be important. So I think it literally is put your money where your mouth is. That's my opinion. And we're going to also, as I said, we're going to spend a lot of money on retention, right? I didn't mention this, but we have an entire integrative health institute that's a sponsor of this event today. And they started doing so many programs for our coworkers, wellness and well-being, which you heard about as well. I had no idea that people would say yes to virtual yoga or virtual acupressure or mindfulness, because we could only do it virtually, right? So, but that cost us money, right? We still, even though it's in the UCI family, we had to compensate our colleagues to do that, right? On behalf of the health system. So that's putting more dollars into it. So I don't think there's an exact dollar figure or percentage personally, but I think if you're gonna strategically prioritize items, which is what we do as leaders, this has to be on your list to invest in.
Can I ask you, Chad, if healthcare is a zero-sum game financially, and many believe that is the case, we can't increase our reimbursement. That's not going to happen. And so if it is zero-sum, so then what has to be given up if we're going to invest more in the way that you just described? What do we give in order to get that?
Yeah, that's the bazillion-dollar question, right? And I think one of the things that we give up is each of the health systems realizing that we cannot be all things to everyone, and therefore partnering with best-in-class partners to fulfill the needs, the healthcare needs of a broader community, doesn't just fall to one organization, right? And so gone are the days where I think you have to do it all, or that you can sustain and do it all. And so I think that's a big difference for us.
And Rick, one thing that's really interesting too is any of the nursing organizations in any of the hospitals and health systems across the country, we have these elaborate orientation programs to ensure especially our new graduates are practice ready, because what the data is showing us is they're not when they get out of school. So one of the things that's incumbent on nurse leaders now is how do we get into the universities and the colleges and the other places where nursing is taught to help start to drive the relevance of what's being taught. We need to be focused on mental health, we need to be focused on community, and we need to be focused on prevention and the promotion of health in the community. So that is going to take people like all of you who have been experiencing things, whether you're a patient, a community member, or a nurse, and challenging our educational centers to up their game. I serve as an assistant dean at the School of Nursing for just that reason. Clinical practice is really critical. That's how I save my money. If I can get the School of Nursing and the other schools of nursing that I do clinical partnerships with to do a better job of practice readiness, I have more time to invest in wellness. I have more time to invest in care development and model changes. I don't have that today necessarily because of the significant investment it takes to get somebody up to speed.
I'd like to comment on that as well, briefly. When we hear that we have more nurses now than we'll ever have nurses, we can't help but think about how do we grow our own. And one of the programs that we have at Providence is called TIPS, Transition and Practice, where we onboard about 500-600 nurses a quarter. Whether a resident, fresh out of nursing school, or a fellow who wants to go into a different specialty. And it is an investment, but it's also our opportunity to grow our own, to build our own, and to contribute to the pipeline that is challenged. The other thing that I'll say briefly is we will be launching a workforce council where we also need to rethink the role of the nurse. And like I said, earlier in what I was sharing, are we having them practice at top of license? And if not, how do we identify what that is, what's taking away the non-productive, if you will, and reallocate that in some fashion for them to be able to focus on that. So I think the need to deconstruct jobs and really understand how do we do it in a way that's going to be manageable and sustainable has to be part of that equation.
Maybe I'll just tie it off with the outsider's perspective here, but I think an important point that I think, Chad, you mentioned earlier, let's not get off the treadmill of having our internal people be the biggest advocates. So if we look at, let's say my industry, for example, there's not one middle schooler out there that wakes up and says, I want to be in insurance, right? So if you look at our space, no one wants to be here, trust me. And so when I look across, a large organization, what you would think that, wow, of course we're pulling from, all these universities, and yeah, we are, but a lot of the successful people have been referrals from family members, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, cousins, brothers, sisters of people that have been, happy, productive, healthy, culturally viable employees that, kind of spread the gospel and say, this is a fantastic business to be in. This is a fantastic industry. I'm a believer in it. And they look up to, John, Steve, Sarah, whoever it is that they see in this space. And they say, wow, this is something that I would like to do because I respect that person. That person seems very happy in the role. And I think that's a big, big part of when we look at culture, happiness, productivity. We talk about investment into well-being and just overall, engagement is huge because that will drive more people to get into this space and not just, this is all industries, but I think in particular healthcare, how do we kind of keep that treadmill going and do it organically? Because like you said, it's a huge investment financially and there's only so many dollars out there.
Great. We have a question back here.
Yes, thank you. Sue Patternap. I'm on faculty here at Mirage, and I'm also CEO of Incline Leadership Strategies. My question pertains to culture as well. I just completed a study of physician burnout since COVID, and one of the issues that fell right at the top for everyone that I interviewed was the disinformation, misinformation that's been out there around COVID and the behavior, the mistreatment, the disrespect that they were feeling more so than ever before in their experiences with patients. In some cases, physicians experienced hostility and felt threatened. In other cases, the sense of moral injury led to some depression and some identity issues and some questioning of whether this is the place where they want to continue to be abused. So I got a lot of that kind of data in my interviews. I'm wondering if that was something that in your organizations you saw, and what kinds of things did you do to help your physicians? And
Great.
Nurses, by the way, because I know the nurses did too.
Great question. I was going to say the nurses had similar experiences with some of the data that we pulled also. I think we have a physician wellness group and it's shared between the School of Medicine and the health system. And it's really centered on making sure that we're not only caring for people, because there was, of course, an increase in impairment too, right? But we're also identifying things that we can do together to improve the environment and to help people have an outlet for that kind of communication. Some of the things that we developed during COVID for nursing and physicians and other providers centered around a peer support mechanism that actually started as the quality monitor who was donning and doffing you or observing you. We gave them a 4-hour education on how to listen and how to communicate. And some of the folks in our units that had prolonged COVID patient populations, the physicians and the nurses came to rely on those people. And that helped kind of take away some of the challenge of what they were facing. But I think right now, even with everything everybody's doing, what we're experiencing in healthcare today with the way that people are treating one another, and it's human to human, it doesn't matter if you're a patient or a provider or a clinician, there are just some gnarly people out there right now. They're angry, they're stressed, they're frustrated, and probably for all the same reasons that you or I might be, but their coping skills are down, and their ability to socialize has changed because we haven't for 3 years. So what are our new norms going to look like? And that's what we're trying to do with our wellness team today. And we've wound it into what we call a safer you. And the goal there is to identify what we need to do to improve workforce safety and also workforce well-being. So it's looking at all of that as a central focus for us moving forward, for just the reasons you've mentioned.
If I may just add, this does not help with our recruitment,
No.
right? I mean, just look in the news about what's happening in airlines. I mean, geez Louise. So factor that times 10 maybe in what we see in healthcare. So workplace violence across, I don't care what position you're in, physician or nurse or others. So we're trying to work on that in a very proactive way, given the environment of everything Karen just said. I totally agree with. And also work on how we can support our caregivers when they're not at work.
Yeah.
We used to think, well, when you leave, you leave. It's not the same anymore, right? You're carrying that burden, right? Really since the pandemic, maybe before. And so how are we supporting you when you're not at work is another very important part.
We have time for one more question. Jeff?
First of all, super interesting panel as we move across from this talent has already won the war to Chad, who says, I'm a CEO, I have constraints, real constraints. And I actually, my question will be off of a comment that, and by the way, I'm Jeff Margolis. I was CEO for 25 years in the industry. I'm on 9 boards in healthcare, from hospitals to technology companies to so forth. I just came back from the National Association of Corporate Directors. I can tell you the whole thing started with a bunch of people up on stage going, we got to retain people, we got to have workforce flexibility. And finally the directors revolted and said, bull. Enough. You guys are looking in the rearview mirror. Pay attention to what's going on in the economy. We've had 12 years of free capital. We've had, the reason anyone could get any job was because there's companies that existed that didn't deserve to exist. Those are going away. Everybody that gets hired has to clear a capital hurdle now of 6 or 8% cost of capital, plus taxes, plus whatever. And so we've hit a point of inflection, if you ask directors of companies, where we're now moving into a ask not what your employer can do for you, ask what you can do for your employer, and that the new generation of people who have existed across this last decade maybe need to understand. And to your point, Karen, people are, every director says people are coming out of school less prepared, not more prepared. CEOs and CFOs are less qualified to run companies than they were a few years ago. So my question to you in the context, and I'm very empathetic towards the challenges we have in healthcare, although I would say if you went to a seminar in 1986, 2006, 2016, or today, it sounds pretty much like this panel. It hasn't changed a ton over time, right? But what strategies are you invoking, and Karen, you touched on it a little bit, maybe to, instead of to bend to the will of a workforce that may not understand what is required to achieve success and quality, how are you working to toughen up, build resilience, build strength, and build stick-to-itiveness so that we can maybe reestablish those values in the workforce that have been missing for the last decade? How's that for provocative?
Yeah, I may start with one thing, Jeff, and you'll appreciate this, which is, I don't know if you lined up 100 of our caregivers and asked them, why did you go into this field? I think not a single one will say, to spend more time on the computer, right? I just love that, right? That's not why they're doing this. And so we are spending a lot of time, which is not new either, but actually translating things that absolutely make the provider experience, and I'm going to use that big term, provider, not just physicians, different so that they can get back to what matters most to them. And I feel like that's come full circle too, and I know you live in that space, so you fully appreciate that. But I think that's where we started when the electronic medical record happened, and boy, did we get a long way away from that. And so I think a lot of things are happening that we're trialing, I know that UCLA is doing and others, that will allow us to feed that, the good beast, if you will, of why people are in this space. And I agree with you, by the way, the market will dictate a change. It's no longer the seller's market, if you will, right? I agree with that as well.
You couldn't have said it better, actually. I think that one of the things that we faced with when going through all these different things is I think the people in leadership have to take a big step back and look at what we believe in and what are the traditions we need to grind up, right? I think I got out of school and pulled a 3 to 11 shift. From my perspective, 3 to 11 was the best shift ever. We've got 2 generations of nurses who don't even know what that is. Now we've got a group of people, this new Gen Z, 3 to 11 is perfect for them. They want to hang and sleep in and do stuff with their friends and do all their social media and then go to work for a few hours and then go home and maybe go out with their friends at 11. All right? It works brilliantly. And I said, how creative can we be? In the olden days, we used to have what we called mother's hours. So let's change it to parents' hours. Come in from 5 to 11 and just help us get everybody tucked in, right? I mean, we're not using the creative stuff or any of the history that we learned. And I think that that's probably the most disappointing thing. When somebody tells me, oh, those Gen Zs, I'm like, there's not a lot of difference. If you take the time to look for the similarities and the patterns, they want something they're passionate about and they want to be recognized for it. Sounds a lot like a baby boomer I know. It's just how we like to be recognized is a little different, and we have this thing in front of our face now if we're a Gen Z that we are going to have horrible thumb injuries with. We should be looking for thumb joint replacements now for later. But and then how do you reignite the passion? How do you reignite that spirit in the people who have been doing this for a long time? We practice relationship-based care at UCLA and at a lot of the UCs, and it's really based on the 3 relationships that you have. Relationship with patient, relationship with colleague, and the most important relationship is the relationship you have with yourself. And if that relationship isn't working so well, the other 2 kind of go out the window. So investing in where your passion is, we have a 3-day retreat that we always have for people to relearn the care model for nurses. We open it up to everyone. We call it Reigniting the Spirit of Caring. And it's really aimed at investing in what brought you to healthcare and what are you passionate about and how do I make you want to go back to healthcare and do it again. And if you talk to the people who have been doing this via Zoom and don't have to do LA traffic, they will tell you first and foremost that it is an intentional 3-day self-care retreat. They don't have, they're home on my dime taking this 3-day event, and that's exactly how they feel. They feel like they've been refreshed and had permission not to do all the things people do when they take a day off. Because if I gave you all 3 days off, how many of you would clean the house, do the shopping, maybe go to the mall, instead of really investing in who you are and reflecting on the things that are important to you? So we can do things like that. We already have hours and hours and oodles of time that we give to people to be oriented and be practice ready and things like that. This should be part of being practice ready. It's not just about the tasks. It's about embracing them, understanding them, and enjoying doing them. So.
We have unfortunately run out of time, but I want to thank the panel for a great discussion. A few little things I just want you to be aware of. First off, Diane wanted me to remind you that you're going to be getting, or tell you, you're going to be getting an evaluation survey via email. So if you would please respond to that evaluation survey, that'll help us to develop our next program, which will be in the winter, I guess, speakers program. Reminder that the 32nd Annual Healthcare Forecast Conference, from which the center has been formed and developed over many, many years, will be happening February 22nd and 23rd right here at the Beckman Center. So we hope that many of you will be able to attend that. Mirage has a new program called the Leadership Development Institute, and three of it's remote education and ongoing continuing education. The three programs that LDI and Mirage have put together are training and education programs for chief nurse executives, chief medical officers, and executive leaders in healthcare. And it's all remote. And if you have any questions about that, please check with Diane. And I want to again thank the sponsors, the Samueli Institute, Be Well Orange County, CHOC, and the UCI School of Medicine's train the new trainers in primary care psychiatry fellowship. And let's thank our panel one more time and say thank you to all of you for joining us today. And we'll be around to have more discussion if anyone has any additional conversation. So thanks very much.